I never cared for subtlety. In my world, control was everything. Control over my company, my employees, my decisions. I didn't tolerate weakness, and I certainly didn't entertain emotions. Emotions were for the weak, the vulnerable, the people who allowed their lives to be dictated by something as impractical as feelings. For nearly 2 decades, that approach had worked flawlessly. I was Richard Blake, a name synonymous with power, success, and wealth. I built my empire brick by brick, and I didn't owe anyone anything, or so I thought. That particular morning started like any other. The sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my high-rise office, casting a golden glow over the sleek, modern furniture. But I barely noticed. My focus was fixed entirely on the spreadsheet in front of me. The numbers weren't just bad, they were disastrous. A dozen flashing red cells stared back at me, each one a reminder of the crisis looming over my company. Profits were down, investor confidence was wavering, and the competition was circling like sharks around a sinking ship. I leaned back in my leather chair, rubbing my temples as the familiar tightness gripped my chest. This wasn't just business, it was survival. If I didn't secure new investment soon, the company I had spent my life building would crumble. And with it, the reputation I had so meticulously cultivated. A knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. "Come in," I barked, not bothering to look up. The door opened quietly, and I heard soft footsteps on the polished floor. It was Evelyn. Of course, it was Evelyn. She'd been my housekeeper for nearly 3 years, and her presence was as unremarkable as the furniture in my office. She was efficient, discreet, and entirely forgettable, just the way I liked my staff. At that moment, she was carrying a small bucket of cleaning supplies, her expression calm and composed as always. "Just polishing the shelves, Mr. Blake," she said in that soft, measured tone of hers. I grunted in acknowledgement, my eyes returning to the screen. But even as she worked silently in the background, an idea began to form in my mind. That evening, I had a dinner scheduled with a group of potential investors. It wasn't just any dinner, it was my last chance to salvage the company. These were men who valued appearances as much as profits. They wanted to see strength, sophistication, and status. Bringing a companion to these events was practically a requirement. But the thought of spending hours pretending to care about someone's vapid small talk was unbearable. And then my eyes flicked toward Evelyn. She was standing by the bookshelf, carefully wiping down the glass shelves. Her movements were deliberate, her posture straight, her expression neutral. She wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, but there was a quiet elegance about her. A simplicity that, under the right circumstances, could pass for sophistication. "Evelyn," I said abruptly, my voice cutting through the silence. She paused, turning to face me. "Yes, sir?" I leaned forward, steepling my fingers as I considered her. "Do you own a dress?" Her brows furrowed slightly, the first sign of emotion I'd seen from her that day. "A dress, sir?" "Yes, a dress," I said impatiently. "Something suitable for a formal dinner." She hesitated, clearly unsure where this conversation was going. I have one, I think." "Good," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You'll be accompanying me to a business dinner tonight." Her eyes widened ever so slightly, but she quickly masked her surprise. "I don't understand, sir." "It's simple," I said, waving a hand dismissively. "I need someone to accompany me to this dinner, and you'll do. Be ready by 7. Wear the dress. And remember, this isn't a social outing. You're there to sit quietly, look presentable, and not say a word unless spoken to. Understood?" She blinked, her composure faltering for just a moment. But then she straightened, her expression smoothing into its usual mask of calm. "Yes, sir." "Good," I said, already returning my attention to the spreadsheet. "That'll be all." She left the room without another word, the door closing softly behind her. I didn't give her a second thought. To me, she was just another tool, a piece of the image I needed to project that night. Quiet, obedient, and completely forgettable. Exactly what the situation required. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and calls, each one more frustrating than the last. By the time evening rolled around, My nerves were frayed, and my patience was non-existent. I arrived at the restaurant early, as always, and stood near the entrance, checking my watch every few minutes. The investors were already seated inside, waiting. The clock was ticking, and Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. Finally, just as my irritation reached its peak, she appeared. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. The woman standing before me was nothing like the Evelyn I knew. She was wearing a simple black dress that fit her perfectly, accentuating her slender frame without being ostentatious. Her hair, usually tied back in a practical bun, was styled neatly, and her makeup, subtle but effective, highlighted features I hadn't noticed before. She looked elegant, polished. I cleared my throat, pushing the thought aside. "You're late," I said sharply, though she wasn't. "Let's go." "Yes, sir," she said, her tone as calm as ever. I led the way into the restaurant, the polished floors and dim lighting reflecting the sophistication of the clientele. The table was set in the center of the room, surrounded by the low murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses. As we approached, the investors looked up, their sharp eyes assessing both me and Evelyn. "This is Evelyn," I said dismissively, barely glancing at her. "She's accompanying me tonight." There was a moment of silence as they took her in. I could see the questions in their eyes, the judgments. Who was she? Why was she here? But none of them said it aloud. Instead, they offered polite smiles, the kind that didn't reach their eyes. "Shall we begin?" I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. The dinner began as expected. Discussions about market trends, expansion strategies, and profit margins dominated the conversation. I led the discussion, as I always did, steering it toward the points that mattered most. Evelyn sat beside me, silent and composed, exactly as I had instructed. For a while, she was everything I needed her to be, present but invisible. But then, as the evening wore on, something unexpected happened. One of the investors, a man named Mr. Lewis, turned his attention to Evelyn. He was tall and imposing, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "So, Evelyn," he said, his tone light but condescending, "what do you think of all this? Must be quite the experience for someone like you." I tensed, my grip tightening on the glass in my hand. This was exactly the kind of attention I had wanted to avoid. Evelyn was supposed to blend into the background, not draw the spotlight. I expected her to give a vague, non-committal response, something polite but meaningless. But instead, she surprised me, and everyone else at the table. The tension from the moment Evelyn first spoke at the table lingered in the air, thick and palpable. I didn't show it outwardly, of course. I never did, but inside, my thoughts churned like a storm. What had possessed her to speak so boldly, to put herself in the center of a conversation where she had no business being? As the dinner progressed, I watched her carefully, half expecting her to falter under the weight of the investors' attention. But Evelyn didn't waver. Every time a question was directed her way, she answered with the same quiet confidence, her words measured yet impactful. I wanted to cut in, to regain control of the narrative, but the investors seemed more interested in hearing her perspective than anything I had to say. Mr. Lewis, in particular, seemed thoroughly captivated. At one point, he leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Evelyn," he began, ignoring me entirely, "you said earlier that understanding the people behind the numbers is just as important as the numbers themselves. What exactly did you mean by that?" Evelyn met his gaze, her posture calm and composed. "What I meant," she said, "is that numbers only tell part of the story. Behind every figure on a spreadsheet are real people, employees, families, communities. When decisions are made without considering their impact, the consequences can ripple far beyond what's visible in the financial reports." The table went silent. Even I found myself momentarily struck by her words. But the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with thought. The investors exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. And then Mr. Lewis nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "An excellent point," he said, "and one that, frankly, isn't raised often enough in rooms like this." I could feel my jaw clench, my irritation growing with every passing second. This was supposed to be my moment to impress, my opportunity to show these men why my company was worth their investment. And instead, they were hanging on the words of my housekeeper, a woman who wasn't even supposed to be noticed. As dessert was served, the investors began steering the conversation in a direction I hadn't anticipated. They started asking questions about social responsibility, ethical leadership, and the role of companies in supporting their communities. These weren't topics I was prepared to discuss, and Evelyn's earlier remarks had clearly set the tone. Every attempt I made to redirect the discussion back to profits and growth was met with polite but firm resistance. I could feel the control slipping from my grasp, and I hated it. But what infuriated me most was the realization that Evelyn wasn't trying to outshine me. She wasn't grandstanding or seeking attention. She was simply being herself. And for some inexplicable reason, that authenticity resonated with the very people I needed on my side. By the time the dinner ended, my patience was threadbare. The investors shook my hand as they left, their smiles polite but their eyes clearly reflecting their admiration for Evelyn. Mr. Lewis lingered for a moment longer, turning to her with a warm smile. "It was a pleasure meeting you tonight, Evelyn," he said. "Your insights were refreshing. I hope we'll have the opportunity to hear more from you in the future." She nodded graciously. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I appreciate that." I barely waited for him to leave before motioning for Evelyn to follow me. The ride back to the mansion was tense, the silence between us thick and oppressive. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. She, on the other hand, sat calmly in the passenger seat, her expression unreadable. When we arrived, I didn't even wait for her to step inside before rounding on her. "What the hell was that?" I snapped, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the night air. Evelyn stopped, turning to face me with that same calm demeanor that had infuriated me all evening. "What was what, sir?" "Don't play coy," I growled, stepping closer. "You were supposed to sit there quietly, not hijack the conversation and turn it into some kind of morality lecture. Do you have any idea how out of line you were?" She blinked, her composure unshaken. "I only answered their questions, Mr. Blake." "You answered them like you were one of them," I shot back. "Like you had a right to weigh in on decisions you know nothing about." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "I was asked for my opinion, so I gave it. If that was inappropriate, I apologize." Her tone was even, almost placating, and it only made me angrier. I wanted her to react, to show some sign that she understood the magnitude of her mistake. But instead, she stood there, perfectly composed, as if she were the one in control. "You don't get it, do you?" I said, my voice lowering into a dangerous growl. "You embarrassed me tonight. Do you have any idea how that makes me look?" She tilted her head slightly, considering her response. "With all due respect, sir, I think the investors were more interested in the substance of the discussion than in appearances." Her words were like a slap in the face, not because they were disrespectful, but because they were true, and that truth stung more than I cared to admit. "Go inside," I said finally, my voice cold, "and don't think for a second that this is over." Evelyn hesitated for a moment, as if she were about to say something more. But then she nodded and walked past me into the house, her footsteps quiet against the polished floor. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the night. For the first time in years, I felt something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger, though that was certainly part of it. It wasn't humiliation, though I felt that too. No, it was something deeper, something I didn't want to confront. Because no matter how much I wanted to deny it, Evelyn had shaken something loose in me, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face what that meant. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear Evelyn's voice echoing in my mind, calm and self-assured, cutting through the polished conversation at the dinner table. The way the investors had leaned in to listen to her, the faint admiration in their expressions. Those images refused to leave me. The following morning, I tried to bury myself in work. Reports, emails, and meetings filled my schedule, but my focus wavered. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew the investors had been more impressed with Evelyn than with me. And that stung. By the time I arrived at my office, Evelyn was already there, tidying up the bookshelves as though nothing had happened. Her composure grated on my nerves. Did she not realize the chaos she'd caused? Or worse, did she know and simply not care? Evelyn, I said sharply, breaking the silence. She turned, her expression neutral. Yes, Mr. Blake? I leaned back in my chair, studying her carefully. For a brief moment, I considered letting the matter go. But my pride wouldn't allow it. We need to talk about last night. She set down the cloth she was holding and clasped her hands in front of her. Of course, sir. I gestured for her to sit, and she hesitated before taking the chair across from me. The dynamic felt strange. Wrong even. I was the one in control here, yet somehow I felt like the one on trial. What happened at that dinner was unacceptable. I began, my tone cold and clipped. You overstepped. I didn't bring you there to share your opinions or make yourself the center of attention. Her expression didn't change, but I noticed a flicker of something in her eyes. Defiance, maybe, or resolve. I wasn't trying to draw attention, Mr. Blake. I was simply answering the questions I was asked. You were asked because you made yourself visible, I snapped. Do you think the investors would have even noticed you if you just stayed quiet like I instructed? She didn't flinch. With all due respect, sir, they asked because they were curious. And I answered because I thought it would reflect well on you. I laughed bitterly. Reflect well on me? You made me look like I'd lost control of my own dinner. Is that how you see it? She asked, her voice calm but firm. Because from where I was sitting, they seemed engaged. Interested. Isn't that what you wanted? Her words struck a nerve, but I refused to let it show. What I wanted, I said evenly, was for you to follow my instructions. I didn't ask you to think or improvise. I asked you to be quiet. For the first time, her composure cracked. A faint flush crept up her neck, and her hands tightened in her lap. I see, she said softly. Then perhaps you should have brought someone else. Her response caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know how to reply. She wasn't apologizing, wasn't groveling like I'd expected. Instead, she was challenging me, albeit subtly. And that infuriated me. You're right, I said finally, my voice colder than I intended. I should have. Consider this your last day here. The words hung in the air between us, heavier than I'd expected. Evelyn blinked, the faintest flicker of shock crossing her face before she quickly masked it. She stood slowly, smoothing her skirt with deliberate care. If that's your decision, Mr. Blake, she said evenly, then I'll respect it. Her calm acceptance only deepened my frustration. I had expected anger, tears, or at least some sign of regret. But Evelyn gave me none of that. She simply turned and walked toward the door, pausing briefly as she reached it. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I never intended to embarrass you. I only wanted to help. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the silence of my office. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I told myself I'd made the right decision, that firing her was necessary to maintain control. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made a mistake. Her final words echoed in my mind, cutting through my defenses with their quiet sincerity. By evening, the mansion felt emptier than usual. I passed her cleaning supplies in the hallway, neatly packed and waiting to be collected. The sight filled me with an unexpected pang of regret. I dismissed it quickly, retreating to my study with a glass of scotch. But as I sat there, staring at the untouched paperwork on my desk, the regret grew harder to ignore. Evelyn had been right, about the investors, about the dinner, about everything, and I'd let my pride get in the way of seeing that. I didn't realize how much I'd underestimated her until she was gone, and by then it was too late to take it back. The morning after Evelyn left was quieter than I expected. No footsteps echoing through the halls, no soft clinking of dishes being tidied, no quiet hum of her presence in the background. At first, I convinced myself it was a relief. No more distractions, no more complications. But as the hours wore on, I found myself glancing toward the door of my office, half expecting her to walk in with her cleaning supplies, as if nothing had changed. She didn't, of course. Evelyn was gone, and the mansion felt emptier without her. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her. I replayed the dinner in my mind, over and over, dissecting every word she'd said. The investors' reactions, the way Mr. Lewis had looked at her, intrigued and impressed. The way her words had shifted the tone of the entire evening. For someone I had dismissed as unremarkable, she had made an indelible impression, not just on them but on me. By mid-afternoon, I was restless. I needed to shake the feeling to reclaim control of the situation. That's when my phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. I snatched it up, relieved for the distraction, but the name on the screen made me pause. It was Mr. Lewis. Richard. His voice boomed through the receiver when I answered. "I've been meaning to call you. About the other night." Here it comes, I thought. The criticism, the subtle rebuke for how I'd handled things. But instead, he surprised me. "I wanted to tell you how impressed I was with Evelyn," he said. "That woman has a sharp mind, a keen understanding of leadership. Honestly, I think you'd be wise to keep her around. She's an asset." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. I gripped the phone tighter, my jaw clenching. "Well," I said after a moment, keeping my tone neutral, "she's no longer with us." There was a pause on the other end, then a low chuckle. "Your loss, Blake. Someone else will scoop her up. Mark my words. A woman like that doesn't go unnoticed for long." The call ended soon after, but his words stayed with me. Someone else will scoop her up. The thought gnawed at me, not because I doubted its truth, but because I knew how badly I had miscalculated. That evening, as I sat alone in my study, sipping my second glass of scotch, my thoughts returned to Evelyn. I remembered the quiet dignity with which she had walked out of my office, the way she had met my anger with calm resolve. For the first time, I wondered what she must have been thinking in that moment. Did she feel vindicated? Hurt? Or was I as insignificant to her as I had tried to make her seem? The next morning brought an answer I hadn't expected. I was in the middle of a call with a supplier when my assistant knocked on the door, her expression unusually hesitant. "Mr. Blake," she said, "there's something you need to see." I waved her in impatiently, gesturing for her to leave whatever it was on my desk. But instead of a file or a document, she handed me a tablet, the screen already glowing with an article. At first, I didn't understand. It was an announcement from a competing firm, one I had long considered beneath my notice. But as I read the headline, my stomach twisted. Prominent investor Mr. Lewis backs rising talent in strategic leadership role. The rising talent in question, Evelyn. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. The article detailed how Mr. Lewis had personally recruited her after their conversation at the dinner. He had offered her a leadership position in a growing company focused on ethical and sustainable business practices, a venture I had ignored as unprofitable. The same values she had championed at the dinner were now the cornerstone of her new role. The realization hit me like a cold wave. She hadn't just impressed the investors. She had outpaced me. While I was stewing in my pride, Evelyn had seized an opportunity one hadn't even seen coming. For a moment, I felt the familiar stirrings of anger, jealousy, and resentment. But beneath that, there was something else, a grudging admiration. She had played the cards she was dealt with skill and poise, turning what should have been a disaster into a triumph. And I couldn't deny it. She deserved every bit of her success. The next few weeks were a blur. News of Evelyn's meteoric rise spread quickly, and with it came whispers about my own misstep. Investors who had once trusted me began to question my judgment. My decisions were scrutinized more harshly than ever, and the cracks in my company's foundation grew harder to ignore. I told myself it was temporary, that I could weather the storm. But deep down, I knew the truth. Evelyn's departure wasn't just a personal loss. It was a professional failure that had exposed the flaws in my leadership for all to see. One evening, as I sat alone in the cavernous silence of the mansion, I found myself thinking not about the business, but about Evelyn. About the person she was, the potential I had overlooked. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Regret. Not just for the decisions I had made, but for the person I had become. Evelyn had been more than just a housekeeper, more than an employee. She had been a mirror, reflecting the weaknesses I had spent my life ignoring. And now she was gone. I told myself that I had moved on, that Evelyn's absence no longer bothered me. But every new headline about her success chipped away at my resolve. Investors I had courted for years were now aligning themselves with her company. Even Mr. Lewis, the man I had relied on to stabilize my crumbling empire, had shifted his focus to her. It was as though she had taken a piece of my world and reshaped it into something brighter, something better, and left me standing in the shadow of her success. Weeks turned into months. My company limped along, battered by poor decisions and wavering confidence. The board meetings became unbearable, each one filled with subtle but pointed critiques of my leadership. They didn't say it outright, but I could see it in their eyes. They doubted me. For the first time in my career, I was losing control. Not just of my business, but of my identity. The breaking point came during a quarterly review. I was presenting a new strategy, one I had painstakingly crafted to regain investor trust. But before I could finish, Mr. Haynes, the chairman of the board, interrupted me. "This plan is all well and good, Richard," he said, his tone carefully measured. "But it doesn't address the underlying issues. We need more than just numbers. We need leadership that inspires trust and confidence, something we've been lacking for some time now." His words hit harder than I expected. I stared at him, struggling to keep my composure. "I've built this company from the ground up," I said evenly. "If you think I'm not capable of leading it, then perhaps you've forgotten who made it what it is." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Finally, Mr. Haynes sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Richard, no one is questioning your past accomplishments. But the world is changing. Leadership today requires more than just ambition and drive. It requires adaptability, empathy, and a willingness to listen." Evelyn understood that, and frankly, it's why she's succeeding where we're struggling. The mention of her name felt like a slap in the face. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew he was right. That night, I sat alone in my office, the weight of the day pressing down on me. For hours, I stared at the glowing screen of my computer, the cursor blinking mockingly on an empty email draft. I didn't know why I had opened it. Maybe it was curiosity or desperation, or something else I couldn't name. But before I could stop myself, I typed her name into the search bar. The results were endless. Articles, interviews, glowing profiles about her work in ethical business practices. Her face was everywhere, smiling confidently in photos taken at conferences and events. She looked different, stronger, more assured. The Evelyn I had known was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. And yet, the more I read, the more I realized she hadn't changed. She had always been this person. I had just been too blind to see it. One headline caught my attention. "From Housekeeper to Visionary: How Evelyn Green is Redefining Leadership." I clicked on the article, my chest tightening as I skimmed through the words. It detailed her journey, from her years as a struggling single mother to her rise as one of the most respected leaders in the industry. There was a quote near the end that stopped me in my tracks. "I believe everyone has the potential to lead," she had said. "But leadership isn't about power or control. It's about serving others, about creating opportunities for people to thrive. That's what drives me, and it's what I hope to inspire in others." Her words echoed in my mind long after I closed the article. They were a mirror, reflecting everything I had failed to be. For years, I had equated leadership with dominance, with bending others to my will. I had built my empire on the backs of people I barely acknowledged, people like Evelyn. And now, she was teaching the world a lesson I should have learned long ago. The next day, I made a decision that surprised even me. I picked up the phone and called her. She answered after the third ring, her voice calm and professional. "Evelyn Green." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Hearing her voice again brought back a flood of memories. The dinner, the argument, the way she had walked out of my office with her head held high. Finally, I found my voice. "It's Richard," I said, the words sounding awkward and foreign. "Richard Blake." There was a brief pause, and when she spoke again, her tone was polite but distant. "What can I do for you, Mr. Blake?" I hesitated, unsure of what I wanted to say. Apologies weren't something I was accustomed to giving, and yet that was exactly why I had called. "I saw the article," I began, my voice faltering. "The one about your work. It's impressive." "Thank you," she said simply, her tone giving nothing away. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to continue. "I wanted to say that I was wrong. About everything. I underestimated you, and I treated you unfairly. You deserved better." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I wondered if she was going to hang up, if my words meant nothing after all this time. But then she spoke. "I appreciate that, Richard," she said, her voice softer now. "It's not something I expected to hear from you." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "You've built something incredible," I said, "and I'd like to learn from you if you're willing." Her laughter caught me off guard. Not mocking, but genuine, warm. "That's quite the turnaround," she said. "But if you're serious, Richard, it's going to take more than words. Change isn't easy." "I know," I said quietly, "but I want to try." For the first time in years, I felt something close to hope. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. Evelyn agreed to meet, though her tone made it clear this wasn't a favor. It was a test. We scheduled the meeting at a neutral location, a small, understated cafe far from the polished boardrooms I was accustomed to. When I arrived, she was already seated, her posture straight, her expression composed. She looked every bit the accomplished professional I'd seen in those headlines. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I belonged in her world anymore. "Richard," she said, her tone polite but guarded as I approached the table. "Evelyn," I replied, pulling out the chair across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to this." "I wasn't sure if I would," she admitted, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "I wasn't sure what you wanted." I paused, realizing I didn't have a perfect answer. "I suppose I wanted to understand," I said finally, "to learn how you built something so remarkable." Her gaze didn't waver, but I saw the faintest flicker of surprise in her eyes. "And what do you plan to do with that understanding?" It was a fair question, one I hadn't fully considered. "I want to rebuild," I said slowly. "Not just the company, but myself. I've spent so much time focused on control and power that I've lost sight of what really matters." Evelyn leaned back slightly, studying me with the same quiet intensity one had seen at that dinner so many months ago. "And you think I can teach you that?" "I think you already have," I admitted. But I wasn't ready to hear it then. Her expression softened slightly, though the guardedness remained. "You're right about one thing, Richard. This isn't just about rebuilding your company. It's about changing how you see the people around you. Leadership isn't about commanding respect. It's about earning it." I nodded, her words hitting harder than I expected. "I know that now, or at least I'm starting to." For the next hour, we talked. Or rather, she talked and I listened. She spoke about the challenges she'd faced after leaving my mansion, the skepticism she encountered when she stepped into her new role, and the relentless effort it took to prove herself. But she also spoke about the rewards, the lives she had impacted, the communities she had helped transform. Her passion was undeniable, and for the first time, I realized how small my own ambitions had been in comparison. As the conversation wound down, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't experienced in years. Humility. "Evelyn," I said quietly, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I see things differently now. And I owe that to you." She didn't respond immediately, her gaze thoughtful. "Forgiveness isn't about absolving someone," she said finally. "It's about moving forward. The question is, are you ready to do that?" The next day, I took my first real step toward change. I began attending meetings not as a leader, but as a listener. I sought out feedback from employees I had once dismissed, asking them what they needed, what they wanted to see from me. The responses were raw and often uncomfortable, but they were honest, and I forced myself to hear every word. I also began studying Evelyn's work more closely. Her company's focus on social responsibility and ethical practices wasn't just a gimmick. It was a transformative approach that had earned her widespread respect. I reached out to experts in the field, attending seminars and reading everything I could find about sustainable leadership. Slowly, I began to see the cracks in my old methods and the potential for something better. But the real test came when Evelyn invited me to visit one of her company's projects. It was a community center in a struggling neighborhood, one that had been on the brink of collapse before Evelyn's company stepped in. The building was modest, but the atmosphere inside was alive with energy. Children were attending after-school programs, adults were learning new skills, and volunteers bustled about, offering support and encouragement. Evelyn greeted me at the entrance, her expression a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "I wanted you to see this for yourself," she said. "These are the people who benefit from the work we do. They're not numbers, Richard. They're lives." As we walked through the center, I listened to their stories. A single mother who had found stable work through a job training program. A teenager who had learned coding and now had a future he couldn't have imagined before. An elderly man who finally had a place to belong. Each story was a reminder of everything I had overlooked in my pursuit of success. These were the people Evelyn had been talking about that night at the dinner table, the ones behind the numbers, the ones I had failed to see. When we finished the tour, Evelyn turned to me, her expression unreadable. "So," she said, "what do you think?" I took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "I think you're right," I said finally. "About all of it. This is what leadership should look like, and it's what I want to work toward." Her gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw a hint of approval. "Then prove it," she said simply. That visit marked the beginning of a new chapter. I committed myself fully to learning from Evelyn's example, not just in theory but in practice. I started small, implementing community-focused initiatives within my own company. The changes weren't easy, and there were plenty of setbacks, but with Evelyn's guidance, I began to see progress. More importantly, I began to see people, not as tools or resources, but as individuals with stories and dreams. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to lead, not from above but alongside. And though the road ahead was long, I knew it was a journey worth taking. The changes I implemented were slow at first, barely perceptible to anyone except those directly involved. I started with a mentorship program for employees at the lower rungs of the company, people I had once barely acknowledged. The results were subtle but undeniable. Over time, these employees became more engaged, their productivity increased, and a sense of purpose began to ripple through the workforce. It wasn't just about the numbers anymore. It was about creating an environment where people felt valued. But even as progress unfolded, the shadows of my past mistakes loomed large. The board remained skeptical, their trust in me still fragile. Investors who had once sung my praises were now wary, watching every decision with sharp eyes. It was a constant reminder that one misstep could undo everything I was trying to rebuild. Amid all this, Evelyn remained a steady presence in my life. Though our paths rarely crossed directly, her influence was unmistakable. She continued to lead her company with the same unwavering commitment to ethical practices, and her name became synonymous with innovation and integrity. I watched from afar, both inspired and humbled by the legacy she was building. It was during one of my visits to a community project, an initiative inspired by Evelyn's work, that I encountered her again. I hadn't expected to see her there, but when I stepped into the bustling room filled with volunteers and participants, she was standing near a table, speaking with one of the project coordinators. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Richard," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "What brings you here?" I gestured toward the room around us. "I've been working on a few initiatives of my own," I said. "I thought it was time to see how they're doing on the ground." Her brows lifted slightly, and I could see the flicker of approval in her eyes. "That's unexpected." "I've been learning," I admitted. "Slowly, But I'm trying. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's good to see you taking action. Leadership isn't just about ideas. It's about what you do with them. The conversation was brief, but it left an impression. As I watched her move through the room, speaking with participants and offering words of encouragement, I couldn't help but marvel at how effortlessly she commanded respect. She didn't demand it. She earned it, simply by being present, listening, and leading with authenticity. The next major test came during a high-stakes meeting with the board. For months, I had been working on a proposal to expand the company's social initiatives, integrating them more deeply into our business model. It was a bold move, one that carried significant risks, but I believed in its potential to rebuild not just the company's reputation, but its very foundation. The meeting was tense from the start. The board members were wary, their expressions guarded as I outlined my vision. I could see the doubts in their eyes, the skepticism that had become so familiar. But I pressed on, presenting not just the numbers but the stories, the lives that had been impacted by the initiatives we had already begun. These aren't just programs, I said, my voice steady but impassioned. They're investments in people, in communities, in the future of this company. We've spent too long focusing on short-term gains at the expense of long-term sustainability. This is our chance to change that. When I finished, the room was silent. For a moment I thought I had failed. But then Mr. Haynes, the chairman, leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You've surprised me, Richard," he said finally. "This is not what I expected from you, but I can see the potential here. And more importantly, I can see that you're committed to making it work." The board voted unanimously to approve the proposal. It was a small victory, but a significant one. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. Not just for the company, but for myself. As the months passed, the changes I had fought for began to take root. The company's culture shifted, becoming more collaborative and inclusive. Employees who had once felt overlooked were now actively contributing to the company's success. And slowly but surely, the trust of the board and the investors began to return. Through it all, Evelyn remained a guiding presence, even if only indirectly. Her success continued to inspire me, a constant reminder of the person I wanted to become. We crossed paths occasionally at events and conferences, and each time, I was struck by how natural it felt to speak with her. There was no longer the tension, the power dynamics that had once defined our interactions. Instead, there was mutual respect, something I hadn't realized I craved until I had earned it. It was during one of these encounters that she surprised me. We were standing at the edge of a crowded room, watching as guests mingled and exchanged pleasantries. She turned to me, her expression serious but not unkind. "You've come a long way, Richard," she said quietly. "I can see the difference." I met her gaze, feeling a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, or admiration. "I've had good examples to follow," I said. "You've taught me more than you realize." She smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "It's not about following, Richard. It's about finding your own way. And I think you're finally doing that." Her words stayed with me long after the event ended. They weren't just a compliment. They were an acknowledgement of the journey I had taken, the growth I had fought for. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. Evelyn's influence had transformed more than just my company. It had transformed me. But as I looked ahead to the future, I realized that the journey wasn't over. There was still so much to learn, so much to build. And this time, I wasn't afraid to take the first step. Change wasn't just a single choice. It was a series of them, one after another, each more difficult than the last. Months of progress had begun to reshape my company, my leadership, and even my reputation, but I knew the real work wasn't in the public victories. It was in the quiet moments, the ones no one else would see. And in many of those moments, Evelyn's voice still echoed in my mind. But as I sat in my office one late evening, reviewing reports from our latest initiative, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't just trying to emulate her anymore. The decisions I made, the risks I took, they were no longer guided by her example alone. I was beginning to find my own voice, my own purpose. It was during one of these late nights that my assistant interrupted me. She rarely did unless it was urgent. "Mr. Blake," she said, stepping into the room hesitantly. "There's someone here to see you." I glanced up, frowning. "At this hour?" She nodded, her expression giving nothing away. "It's Evelyn Green." The pen in my hand paused mid-stroke. Of all the things I had expected, this wasn't one of them. Evelyn and I had crossed paths professionally, exchanged pleasantries, even had brief conversations at events. But for her to show up at my office unannounced, it was unprecedented. "Send her in," I said, standing as my assistant left. When Evelyn entered, she was as composed as ever. Her presence filled the room, commanding attention without effort. But there was something different about her tonight. A subtle tension in her posture, a seriousness in her expression. "Evelyn," I said, gesturing to the seat across from me. "To what do I owe the honor?" She didn't sit. Instead, she placed a folder on the edge of my desk, her eyes locking onto mine. "I need your help, Richard." The words startled me. Evelyn Green didn't ask for help. She didn't need to. Yet here she was, standing in my office, breaking every assumption I had ever made about her. "What kind of help?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. She sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she finally took the seat. "My company has been expanding rapidly. Too rapidly. We're facing logistical challenges, resource shortages, and I've been reluctant to bring in external partners. But now I don't have a choice." "You're asking me to partner with you?" The idea was almost absurd. Months ago, we had been adversaries, our worlds colliding in ways neither of us had anticipated. But now, she nodded, her gaze steady. "You've built something incredible, Richard. I've seen the changes you've made, the progress, and I believe we can accomplish more together than apart." Her words carried a weight I couldn't ignore. For so long, I had thought of her as a rival, someone whose success had come at my expense. But in this moment, I realized how wrong I had been. Evelyn wasn't my competitor. She was my equal. "I'll need to see the details," I said finally, gesturing toward the folder. "Of course," she replied, her tone brisk. "But this isn't just about numbers. It's about trust. If we do this, it has to be a true partnership. No power plays, no hidden agendas." I smiled faintly. "You've changed too, Evelyn. You're more direct than I remember." She returned the smile, though hers was softer. "I've learned to be." The partnership that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Evelyn and I worked together as equals, each bringing our strengths to the table. She challenged me in ways no one else ever had, pushing me to think beyond the immediate, to consider the long-term impact of every decision. And in turn, I found ways to support her vision, offering insights and strategies she hadn't considered. The results were extraordinary. Together, we launched a series of projects that transformed entire communities, creating opportunities and hope where there had been none. The impact wasn't just measurable, it was tangible. And for the first time in my career, I felt a deep, abiding sense of fulfillment. But beyond the professional triumphs, something deeper began to grow between us. It was unspoken at first, a quiet understanding that went beyond respect. The long hours we spent together, the shared victories and setbacks, they created a bond that neither of us could ignore. One evening, as we stood on the balcony of a newly opened community center, watching the sun set over the city, Evelyn turned to me. "You've come a long way, Richard," she said, her voice warm. "I'm proud of you." The words caught me off guard. I had spent so long seeking validation, approval, but hearing it from her felt different, felt real. "I couldn't have done it without you," I admitted. "You showed me a better way." She smiled, but there was something else in her eyes, something that made my heart race. "You found your own way," she said softly. "That's what matters." In that moment, I realized how much she meant to me, not just as a mentor, a partner, or even a friend, but as someone who had fundamentally changed my life. And I knew I couldn't let the moment pass. "Evelyn," I began, my voice hesitant but steady, "there's something I need to tell you." She turned fully to face me, her expression curious. "What is it?" I took a deep breath, summoning the courage I had always prided myself on but rarely used in matters of the heart. "I care about you," I said simply. "More than I ever thought possible." For a long moment, she didn't respond. The silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken possibilities. And then, to my relief and joy, she smiled. A genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. "I care about you too, Richard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words were like a balm, soothing years of regret and uncertainty. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in golden light, I knew we had both found something we hadn't even realized we were searching for. A chance to begin again, together. The partnership we built, both professionally and personally, became the foundation of a legacy far greater than either of us could have imagined. Together, we redefined what leadership could be, proving that compassion and ambition weren't mutually exclusive. And in doing so, we discovered a purpose and a love that gave meaning to everything we had worked for.